This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon have displaced 800,000 people and killed nearly 700 people in the country. Among those displaced, 200,000 people are children. The conflict is being felt in Lebanese communities across Connecticut, and today we'll hear from members of the state's Lebanese diaspora. We'll also hear from a global humanitarian aid organization working on the ground in Lebanon. But up first, we want to bring back a voice Where We Live listeners might have heard before. Arsen Fahim is a musician, pianist, composer, and conductor. He's also an Afghan refugee who left the country after the Taliban returned to power in 2021. He currently lives in Massachusetts. We spoke to him last week to hear of his thoughts on what's happening in the Middle East. Let's jump back into the conversation. So, Arsen, I'm sure you've been following this whole time that over the last year, the U.S. and Israel have struck Lebanon and Iran, displacing 800,000 people in Lebanon alone and causing much unrest across the Middle East and its surrounding regions. What has it been like for you to witness what's been happening overseas?
In so many ways, it feels painfully familiar, and it makes me think about Afghanistan and Iraq, even though I was very, young and don't remember that, obviously. But I think about where all of that led to and how that has affected Afghans today. And it just makes me feel like we haven't learned from history that like not letting other countries decide their own fate and their own future is does not really end well. And I worry that the same could happen in Iran or in Venezuela or I mean, of course, Palestine is like a, a perfect example of that. So to me, all of that reminds me of how the US came in with so many promises of bringing democracy and women's rights and freedom and all of these things to Afghanistan. And yet, in a minute, abandoned Afghanistan with no regard for any of those, saying we were here for, whatever purpose, for our national security or whatever, we got it. We don't need to be here. That none of that was our plan.
Well,
And
go for it. Continue.
and I wonder, how much of the truth we're hearing now.
Well, and we're. I just want to mention that we're going to get into your own history and your background in a little bit. But because you've been following this, of course, what have you been hearing from family and friends who are still in Afghanistan and Middle East today?
I think all of what's going on worries at least my family and friends back home a lot because Afghanistan is just such a central location to so many of these places that are facing this uncertainty. We're right next to China and Russia and the Middle East, Iran, and we just worry that we're also gonna get dragged into this.
And because you mentioned earlier that from your perspective, it feels like history is kind of repeating itself, and it also feels like nothing has been learned from the past. Is there anything top of mind that you want to share about how people in the Middle East are viewing the latest American strikes?
Well, I think I've been seeing that, like Iran specifically, there is, support for it within certain Iranian communities. Um, and obviously, like, I'm not a fan of that regime. I hate that regime. Um, and I can see why many Iranians, especially Iranians abroad, are happy about him not being in power anymore. Uh, Yet, I feel like perhaps, as much as I hope that all of this ends well, I just don't think another country comes in and gets involved for the benefit of someone else. There's always, something that they want in return. And I don't know how much I feel safe about this just being a kind act of generosity.
Well, and you have had many complicated experiences with the layers of what that means, what you mentioned about someone else coming in and taking over because you were in Afghanistan before the Taliban took over. You just had a couple of days before the takeover
Mhm.
happened in 2021. Could you help us understand what those days and weeks and months were like before the takeover?
Um, Extremely intense, I think is how I describe it, because every day the violence was increasing and things were getting worse. There was more war. The Taliban were gaining more territory. Yet, no one really thought that it would be this fast, that they would get complete power. Like within a few days, they took over all the major cities. Um, and the peace talks were going on. And as they were, in the couple of months prior, gaining more territory, the assumption was like, okay, they're going to use this as a negotiating tactic and perhaps get a bit more of what they want. But, you know, by the time that they took over, even like in the weeks prior, it seemed kind of obvious that they don't really need to negotiate at all because they can just get everything that they want. Like, even if they hadn't taken over forcefully, I think they were in a position of power where they could negotiate and get whatever they would have wanted. Um, and seeing that from afar, from, being in the US, it did feel personally to me very, very much like I had abandoned my country. And I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. I don't know if I could have done much if I was in Afghanistan. I don't think I could have. Yet, at least I would have been there, and I would have been with my friends and family, and would have gone through the same thing that they did. But that's an emotion that I continue to feel, and I try to make the most of the opportunities that I have been, privileged to have by being in the US and having the freedom to make music and having the freedom to say what I believe and having the all the opportunities around me. I think by making the most out of it to, tell the world about Afghanistan and what's going on there is how I deal with those feelings.
And in those moments, leaving and coming here in the US, as you say, there's so much complicated feelings and emotions about leaving your home. Did you know in those moments or do you know what moment was it for you when you realized that you want to take the world or not take the world, but you want to sort of use your opportunities, like you mentioned, use the freedom that you have to tell the world about Afghanistan. Was that something that came to you early on, or did you leave knowing that was what you wanted to do?
Well, I think that is something that I wanted to do and was doing to some level even before I left Afghanistan, because uh, part of being a musician to me was telling the world that Afghanistan is more than just the tragedies that you hear about and the headlines that you read about. That, we are human beings who feel things, and we're just like you, and just like you, we make art, and we dance, and we play music, and we write poetry, and we express human emotions. And to me, that's like extremely essential because I think I've noticed that more than ever since I've been in the US, but people do know about Afghanistan and they have read about it. It's just that it feels so far away, so disconnected, so like alien and like I don't somehow not real. And I think my one of my goals as a musician is to change that, make it a more emotional reaction by listening to music from Afghanistan.
Well, it's been a few years since we last spoke with you, and you're a musician. Can you remind our listeners how you were first introduced to music? Because it was a really powerful moment that led to you to your future.
Um, I had been interested in music since I saw Roman Polanski's The Pianist, the movie. And back then I was living in Pakistan and there was no opportunity for me to actually take lessons or even see a piano. But I remember as a kid just being curious about how this instrument can save a person's life. So I that curiosity just stayed with me until in 2012 I I had moved just back to Kabul from Pakistan and I knew about the Afghanistan National Institute of Music, which was the country's only music school and it was completely free. So I decided to sign up, and that, like at age 12 or 13, was when I saw a piano for the first time, and I immediately fell in love. And I think within like the first few minutes of my first lesson, decided like, okay, this is what I want to be doing for the rest of my life. Um, I didn't expect it would be this hard. I didn't at the time understand that there are going to be people who are going to want to kill me for this, and that this, in a matter of a decade or so, is going to be a crime in my country. Um, but once I did find out those things, it made me even more passionate to be a musician because they felt completely unacceptable.
Well, and I wanted to ask you more about that, if I can, because I know we talked about it last time too, where or you shared with us the restrictions that the Taliban has put on music, and how this is a space where, like you mentioned, you could be killed for it, and with your own experience of being targeted at a very young age because you were going to school for music, and now that you're here working with music. How does all of that experience inform you when you're making music or listening to music? Has your relationship with music grown and changed over the last couple of years?
Um, I think in many ways it hasn't really changed. I feel the same sense of responsibility and in a way like a burden that I'm carrying of like I'm not just making music. Every time I make music, I'm also making a statement. And I'm saying, no, I'm going to keep doing this. And I feel that every time I play music, every time I write music. But I think it also just has made me, like being in the US and seeing so many people around me take music for granted, has just made me realize what a privilege it is to like be able to take something for granted. And when I say that, I'm not saying that it's wrong to take music for granted. I'm just saying it's how unfortunate it is that not everyone can do that.
And I know you described it as a burden, and because you're also in a place where you have the freedom to make those statements, you have the freedom to carry on your mission. Does that feeling of the combination of having that freedom and carrying that burden, is that a powerful inspiration for you to continue to do the work, or do you find it to be, or can it be too much sometimes?
It's extremely inspiring to me. I feel like, in a way, it's a privilege because I believe that making art should not be disconnected from the society we live in and the things happening around us. And we need art that reflects, whatever issues of the times we live in are, whether that's our environment or war or poverty or inequality, whatever it might be. I feel like art needs to somehow create dialogue about all of those things. And for me, that's just so easy because any piece of music I write, I get to do that. Just a simple act of making music is political. And to me, that's a good thing. Um, but also, it makes me want to do it so much more. It makes me want to write more music and play more music. I feel like a teenager whose parents tell them not to do something and they want to do it even more. Um, I mean, that's perhaps, not the best example, but it's a similar feeling of like, I'm going to do this because I can't let you stop me. Because if you stop me from doing this, what else are you going to take away from me? I think about women's rights. How are we going to stand up for that if we can't stand up for music, which feels so much more, in a way, basic than that? How are we going to stand up for freedom of expression and, freedom of information and all the million other basic human rights and dignities that the Taliban are taking if I can't stand up for music, which again, every society ever has had music. We've had music for longer than we've had language. So if we let them take something that basic away, how are we going to stand up against all of those other things? So in that way, to me, music feels like a front line that I can't give up.
Well, and I feel like the example you gave was perfect, being a teenager fighting against parents. Not to make light of the example, but I feel like that's something that would resonate with a lot of people. I think many of us can understand that feeling of wanting to push back. And then in your case, of course, it's such a statement, or it's so many statements that you're making here to share the home that you love. And may I say, you're sharing it in your home, in a different home today, and hopefully people are listening. And I wanted to ask, because you mentioned statements a couple of times, I'm curious to hear, what are some of those statements? What are some of your beliefs that you would like to express through music and you hope that people can hear it?
I think first and foremost is saying to the Taliban, I'm not, you're not going to silence us. We're going to keep making music. Um, the word I would use is probably not appropriate for me to say on radio. And then there's, to all the people who listen to my music, to the Afghans, I hope it's a source of hope that they can see that, we're keeping this culture and this art and this beautiful form of expression alive and thriving, even during this time when it's banned in the country. I hope for Afghans around the world that brings some solace and some comfort and some hope. And then for audiences beyond, for all the non-Afghans, I hope this is just, as I mentioned earlier, a way to connect with Afghanistan on a much deeper level. But I think first and foremost, definitely, is just making a statement of defiance by making music and saying, nope, we're not going to stop if anything, we're going to make music more loudly than ever. And that is happening. There's more young Afghans studying at music schools around the world right now than ever before. So, while certainly in many ways music has been silenced, it's also thriving in new ways that it had in ways that it had never thrived before.
And before we let you go, I have one last question for you. Recently, you spoke at the concert in solidarity with Afghan musicians, where 8 new pieces by Afghan composers, including pieces composed by musicians hiding in Afghanistan. Can you tell us how this project came together?
Yes. Well, when I moved to the US and Afghanistan collapsed, and I was feeling, all the feelings that I described earlier, all of those just naturally led to me putting together a concert of Afghan music. The first concert was all online because of COVID, and it was very small, just a few like chamber ensembles. But the goal was that musicians get to come together and just make a statement of solidarity with Afghan musicians by playing music from Afghanistan, saying that we're with you and we care about this music, and in a way, just reflecting about that by learning some music from Afghanistan. And it was such a beautiful experience to see all of these people, all of these wonderful musicians do that with so much care and enthusiasm and love. Um, and naturally, for the next year, we decided to do it again. And this time we had a small chamber orchestra that came together and a couple of Afghan musicians. Our venue had 500 seats and was completely filled. And again, that feeling of support from the community was extremely beautiful. And in 2024, I started a new program at the New England Conservatory, and I decided to do it again at my new school. And here we are. And this time it's been more ambitious than ever before. We had, as you mentioned, 8 new pieces that we commissioned, and we were able to bring together like over a dozen Afghan musicians. We had, I think, 80 musicians in the orchestra, and I think it's beautiful to see that kind of enthusiasm from musicians and be able to, tell them about what's going on in Afghanistan and kind of give them this platform to join us in that statement that we make, and do that together. I'm hoping this is something that I can continue to do.
Well, I just want to wish you the best of luck, and thank you so much for joining us today, Arsen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
That was Arsen Fahim, who's a musician and conductor. Coming up, we hear what's happening on the ground in Lebanon, and we hear from Connecticut residents with ties to the country. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about the war in the Middle East. Airstrikes have hit Iran and Lebanon, causing chaos and death across the region. Joining us now is Bilal Tajildeen. He's the former member of the Waterbury Board of Aldermen. His parents immigrated to the United States from Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War. Bilal, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to get into a little bit more about your family background, but you were listening in on Arsen's conversation earlier, and I see you're nodding a lot. I would love to get your reactions on some of the things that Arsen has shared.
Yeah, the parts that he was saying that really resonated, I think, have to do with wondering what you would do if you were in the country at the same time, right? You hear a lot of folks in the United States say things like, well, this would never happen here, and if something happened here, I would do X, Y, and Z. And then your parents immigrate out of a country or immigrate to a new country, and you look back at this other place you call home, and you wonder how you'd respond if you were there. That was, I think, a really powerful sentiment from him.
When you have family in Lebanon, can you tell us more about your connection with the country?
Yeah. So my parents immigrated here in the 80s when they were married. My father had been coming for about a decade prior to that, but they left during the Lebanese Civil War, which lasted around the mid 70s to the early 90s, and saw about 1 million people leave Lebanon. So it was a huge exodus. They left for reasons why anyone leaves a war-torn country, right? Stability, raising a family, economic mobility as a major factor. And those are unfortunately still components that Lebanese people are struggling with every day on the ground. And it's been exacerbated by not only what's happening right now, but 15 years of political instability.
Well, and there's a pretty large Lebanese immigration or immigrant population here in Connecticut. Can you give us an idea of what that community looks like?
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of the folks who live in Connecticut, a lot of Lebanese people that came here all came from very similar parts of Lebanon. So when we were growing up, it was always this constant rotation of new people moving to Connecticut. A lot of them moved to Waterbury at the start, right? A lot live in Danbury. A lot of folks live in the Valley, and getting together with them was almost like going to like the Lebanese social club, right? And people would sit around and they would talk about what they missed about being home and what they found strange or exciting about living in the U.S. But one of the things that took a long time, I think, to move past was that a lot of the folks, because they left during the Civil War, brought with them a lot of the religious, political tensions that they had just escaped from. So I think it took a while for the Lebanese community in Connecticut to solidify more cohesively. But I think it's been trending much better, and I am hopeful for what's going on in Lebanon in terms of a strong government there now.
Well, I think in many ways it's hard for people to imagine carrying not just your family from your home to a different place, but to carry that culture and, as you say, the tension, the history, because there's a long history of political tension and conflict in Lebanon. And I want to get to that in a little bit. But since you mentioned like lots of families have come over with very similar backgrounds, and you were born and raised in Connecticut, but you have strong ties with Lebanon because you were able to visit during the summers. So you maybe in some ways perhaps have a connection with the country whereas someone else might not have if they didn't have the chance to visit. What were those trips like? And when you last visited, what was that like?
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to actually be there last summer. I spent just under a month with my mom, who lives here in Connecticut. We went to go see my grandmother, who moved back actually a couple years ago. And she wanted to live toward the end of her life back in home. She did not want to be outside of it, right? And I remember before she left, I was nervous for her to go back. She was going back during another time of conflict. And I'd asked her, I said, well, what if you go and you get stuck there? And she kind of shrugged at me in a very casual way a lot of Lebanese people do when you mention how dangerous things might be. And she said, you can't get stuck where you're from. And so for her, it wasn't an issue. She was going to go back home, and I got to spend a lot of time with her last summer, which was really good. But it's been a better trip, I think, the past couple years, as, like I said, the government in Lebanon has solidified. There was a gap in presidency for a while, which left a lot of instability. A lot of folks have said it feels like a new day in Lebanon with a powerful anti-corruption, trending toward a powerful anti-corruption government. And so folks were feeling some relief, obviously, up until a couple weeks ago, where they could feel some relief.
Well, I want to take a moment to have two Connecticut residents who have called us and wants to share their story. Reem Hadir is the chef and founder of Lebanese Mediterranean Kitchen and Bar in Watertown, and also George Nujim, who is the chef owner of Nujim's Mediterranean Cuisine in Winstead. And George, thanks for calling in, and I want to go with you here first here. You've been listening to this, respond to what we've heard so far and what we're seeing overseas.
Good morning. Well, I shared the same sentiment that my friend just mentioned. We are heartbroken to what's happening to beautiful Lebanon. Last time I was on the show, all I talked about is how beautiful Lebanon is. We, the Lebanese American people, condemn all type of violence, whether from this side of the border or the other side of the border, and our heart is broken. Over 1 million people have been displaced, and when people get displaced, they're not from one religion or the other. They're all Lebanese, Muslim, Christian. So we're all Lebanese. So it's very sad what's happening to Lebanon. We had hope, and now everything is shattered. I was planning on going to Lebanon in April, and I'm still hoping to go to Lebanon in April, but I just don't know. It's very sad.
Well, it sounds like many Lebanese members of the Lebanese community has been caught in that same web of wanting to go back but not being able to right now. Reem, do you have plans to do so? Can you respond to what's been going on as well?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I've been listening to Bilal and George, and I share the same thoughts, of course. Unfortunately, for me, actually, more than anything, so because having the restaurant all these years and not having maybe a manager with me, because I manage my own restaurant, and not having family here as far as like that can help me out with the restaurant, it's been hard for me to travel to Lebanon. So all these years, I want to say it's been 14 years, I haven't been back to Lebanon. So my kids are 13 and 8, and both of them, even the 8-year-old, but more so the 13-year-old, maybe on daily basis asks me to go to Lebanon. And Mom, are we going to Lebanon to, he's Lebanese. He's just never been. He knows the culture. We own a Lebanese restaurant. We live the Lebanese culture on daily basis. And we were so ready to take these kids and finally have them see their country, their origin came from, all the beauty of Lebanon, all the things they see online and on, all these social media places, and they see the beauty of Lebanon. They're always asking me. Finally, we were able to manage to have somebody watch this summer, and then we were all hoped. The week that this happened and started literally was the week we were going to purchase our tickets to go. Unfortunately, I was hesitant to do so because I wasn't sure what's going on, what's going to happen, how long is this going to last. And for the safety of all and my kids, I refrained from doing so. With all hopes, I was talking to my aunt this morning who is in Lebanon, and I'm telling her, unfortunately, I might not be able to go here another year. And she's telling me all about what's going on there a little more. She's like, please, I love you, and I want you to come down. But I do want you to come down when everything is good and when you can come and show your kids the real Lebanon and take them in each and every spot around Lebanon. It would be their first time, and it wouldn't be nice for them to come and endure what's going on right now there. So, yeah, our plans have been canceled. But, what are our plans, versus the pain of all these people that are getting leaving their houses or losing people or living in fear every day. I mean, vacation plans are nothing, but it's the moral of the story that we, as Lebanese here, we look forward to go to our beautiful country and visit it. And even my customers, I had literally a customer that wanted to join in and come with us. I had my waitress from here that's not Lebanese that wanted to come with us. Like, that's how much we have love for our country, that whoever knows a Lebanese person will get that love from them.
Well, thank you so much, Reem, for sharing that with us, and best of luck to you and your family and George as well. And this is very similar to the conversation that we had with George and Reem last time they were on the show to talk about what's been going on in Lebanon. And I want to introduce Kelly Razouk, who is the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the International Rescue Committee, which is a global humanitarian aid organization. So, Kelly, you've been listening to what George and Reem have shared, and the IRC is currently providing emergency and long-term support to people who are affected by the crisis. What are you currently hearing from those on the ground in Lebanon?
Thanks, Catherine. And as your callers just articulated, this is heartbreaking. We have seen Lebanon in the last few months really trying to rebuild, as your callers were just talking about, as Bilal was talking about. There's really been a focus on trying to build back from 2024, when so many people had lost their homes, when people had been suffering under the economic collapse, under so much that had happened. And what we're seeing right now really is a crisis within a crisis. The International Rescue Committee put out in December our emergency watch list of countries that we were looking at, countries that we were concerned about for 2026. And Lebanon was on that list. It was among the top 10 because we were concerned. You still had 80% of the population living in poverty. You had the prolonged economic and humanitarian emergency. You also have Lebanon hosting the highest number of refugees per capita of any place in the world. So already there were concerns, and there was a real focus in the humanitarian community on ensuring that Lebanon had the tools it needed to ensure that the population could build back. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the past 2 weeks is growing humanitarian emergency and growing humanitarian crisis. We now have, as was referenced, over 800,000 people who are displaced, and the figures continue to grow. 200,000 of those are children, and we saw that just in the span of a few days. Our staff on the ground, some of them have also been displaced. They've had to move. We're working very closely with our team on the ground to be able to support those Lebanese who have been displaced. So many of them have moved into shelters, which really are educational facilities, schools. These are not facilities that were prepared to have things that the population needs when it comes to things like mattresses, to be able to sleep, to be able to have medicines. People just packed up whatever they had in their cars or on foot and left. Children, had just the clothes on their back, and they're arriving into these shelters with next to nothing. And so our team on the ground is very focused now on ensuring that we can get those basics taken care of: hygiene kits, blankets, food, medical medicines, those kinds of urgent humanitarian needs, to make sure that we're able to address those on the ground.
And Bilal, before we go to break, got about a minute here. With the conflict that's happening so frequently in this region, as we've heard from the past history, do you think it's become normalized that this is just another thing that happens today?
For sure. And I think it's normalized in two ways. I hear a lot of people in the United States talk about the resilience of the Lebanese spirit. And it kind of makes me uncomfortable when it's positioned as resilience, because yes, people are surviving, but they're surviving in and out of conflict and conflict and conflict. And it's not to romanticize that, right? I mean, if you're 15 years old, your entire life has been spent in conflict, right? If you're a refugee in Lebanon, it's been in conflict or in a camp. So I think we've become desensitized to it, maybe more than we've normalized it. And kind of like my cousins, like Reem was saying, speaking to folks that are living in Lebanon right now, I'll check in with cousins who live maybe 10 miles away from a place that a bomb has been dropped onto. And I'll ask them how they're doing, and they'll make it sound like 10 miles is 50 miles and they're totally safe, and they have to rationalize it because they're still going to work.
You've been listening to Bilal Tajildeen, who's a former member of Waterbury Board of Aldermen, and also Kelly Razouk, who's the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the IRC, and they'll both be staying with us. This is Where We Live. We'll be back after a short break. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking about the conflict and displacement unfolding in Lebanon, and the future of global humanitarian aid is precarious. Still with us is Kelly Razouk, who is with the IRC, the International Rescue Committee. And Kelly, earlier you mentioned that the IRC had published a 2026 emergency watch list, which outlined 10 profiles of countries that are in dire humanitarian crisis. So we were talking about Lebanon earlier. Going beyond it, conflict across the globe appears to be rising. We seem to be hearing about a new crisis every day. What are you seeing, and what support are you able to give?
Thanks, Catherine. And that's exactly right. The number of conflicts is at a record high, and yet we've seen in the last year massive cuts to global aid. So projected cuts in 2025 were over 30 billion. And when you look across at the number of conflicts and crises, Yemen, Sudan, all of these crises, and then you have something like the emergency situation that's taking place in Lebanon now, and the international community, given all of these cuts, is not as prepared to be able to respond with humanitarian aid. And so the International Rescue Committee has been really focused on calling on governments to ensure that they are investing in the humanitarian aid and ensuring that they're both putting the diplomatic pressure on those governments who are parties to the conflict, but also we need that global aid investment. We need private funders to be funding humanitarian aid. We need governments to, again, be infusing these conflicts and crises with the humanitarian aid that is needed.
And so we often see more conflicts start. What about resolving the conflict? Because it seems like that's becoming harder and harder to do if they ever get resolved.
It definitely does seem like that. And we're seeing more protracted conflicts, so they're lasting longer as well. And we do need those diplomatic solutions. As an international humanitarian organization, for us, the humanitarian situation on the ground is first and foremost. There needs to be protection of civilians. There needs to be protection of civilian infrastructure and protection of humanitarian workers to ensure that they're able to access those populations that they need to reach. So we're very concerned about the need for there to be diplomatic solutions, and that all of those diplomatic tools need to be pursued so that we don't have these endless conflicts, and so that we don't have people who have already been displaced, like in Lebanon, who are now getting displaced yet again and don't know when this conflict is going to end.
Well, you mentioned infrastructure earlier in Lebanon, because there have been attacks on health services and medical facilities across the country, and the healthcare system in Lebanon was already fragile. So what does this mean for the general population and those who are in dire need of healthcare?
That's right. There obviously have been attacks on healthcare facilities. We've seen a need for, before this conflict even started, things like medicine, medical supplies, for rebuilding the healthcare system in Lebanon. And that's where we really needed to see investments by the international community. As Bilal said, you can't just say the Lebanese are resilient, everything's going to be fine. The international community needs to take action. They need to support Lebanon with the funding, with the rebuilding, and ensuring the Lebanese people have those tools going forward.
When you mentioned diplomacy and the need for that kind of support, this is also a holy time for Muslims recognizing Ramadan and Christians recognizing Lenten season. And Pope Leo actually visited Lebanon earlier this year. Can you talk about what have we heard from religious leaders around the globe regarding this conflict? Because there seems to be pressure to resolve it as soon as possible.
That's right, Catherine. There definitely have been calls to resolve this as soon as possible, as you said, from the religious community leaders, from the UN Secretary General, who just flew to Lebanon over the weekend and who was in the country, again, pushing for a diplomatic solution and for an end to the conflict, because it is civilians who are bearing the brunt of this conflict and who are really caught in the crosshairs here.
And I think one of the humanitarian aid needs that are not often talked about is mental health support. So are your workers and the people who they're working with on the ground, are they both getting mental health services?
We're very focused on the mental health aspects of this. And so the International Rescue Committee and our team on the ground are supporting mental health services. We're supporting Lebanon's National Suicide Prevention Hotline, where there have been many calls. And you can imagine, given the situation with this war, that toll that it's taking on individuals. We're also working to ensure that children, those who are vulnerable, have that trauma care going forward. And as you know, even after the bombs stop, the trauma continues. And so there is a need for us to invest in this area and to make sure that those social workers in Lebanon, that those who are providing that care have the tools necessary to continue providing that to the Lebanese population.
Well, and then really quickly here, because talking about funding cuts and the need to invest, are you seeing people stepping up to invest more, to give more support when you're in a time where funding is being cut and you're getting less of that?
We have seen some bright spots in some private donors, in people like, I'm sure those who are listening to your show are stepping up and saying, we really see the needs and we want to respond. And that is extremely compelling and gives me a lot of hope that despite these cuts to global aid, there are people around the world who recognize the needs and who want to do their part to contribute.
And Bilal, I would love to bring you back here. Bilal Tajildeen, who's a former member of the Waterbury Board of Aldermen. Just some final thoughts here for our listeners who've been listening. What are some takeaways that you hope they take away from today's conversation?
Yeah, I think what's really important to always keep in mind, right, is that what's happening in Lebanon right now, sort of these unmitigated attacks by Israel, I think it's important to recognize that these are happening within the context of the past 2.5, 3 years, right? So the whole planet has become desensitized to watching attacks in the vague Middle East. And what that results in is groups of people not really understanding, right? You can easily kind of shrug things off as being too complicated, or, well, it's always been like that, or, what's the change going to happen? When is change going to happen? And I would have people really take away that all of these places that we talk about as being so far away are not, right? When we feel that when an oil tanker gets blown up, right? We feel that pinch, but we don't always feel it when we hear the news about, a refugee camp in Lebanon getting bombed. And so I would encourage folks to really think about the scope and size of the world and how close these attacks really are to all people.
You've been listening to Bilal Tajildeen, who's a former member of the Waterbury Board of Aldermen. Thank you so much, Bilal, for being on the show today.
Thank you.
You're also listening to Kelly Razouk, who's the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at the International Rescue Committee. Kelly, appreciate your time as well.
Thank you, Catherine.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.